Madam Chair, we are recording the meeting and we are live.
All right, welcome everybody to the PCAC meeting, June 22nd. I'll take roll first. We have Councilmember Sonia Miles present, okay, and Councilmember, Board Member Steve Takis current opponent. Supervisor Walter Alcorn, Supervisor Sylvia Glass. Here, okay. Supervisor Margaret, Franklin, she is joining remotely, I believe. Are you joining? Are you there, Supervisor Franklin?
She's not there yet.
She's not here yet. Okay. And Councilmember Sarah Bagley, Councilmember Phil Duncan,
Here.
Councilmember John Steely,
Here.
Vice Mayor Pamela Sebesky.
She's on here.
Oh, I'm sorry. And what's your name?
Ralph Smith.
Oh, right. Okay. Thank you so
City
much.
Council.
Vice Mayor Preston Banks.
Here.
And Councilmember Sidney Fredericks. Here. And Vice Mayor Marty Martinez. And Councilmember Stanley Ballon. All right. Thank you. Okay, summary notes of May 25th, 2022. Are there any changes to those notes? Anybody wants to make any changes? Okay, I move that the notes are approved. All in favor, say aye. Aye. You did second it. All right. Next on the agenda is review FY 2022-27 six-year program staff recommendations.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening, everyone. This is a very, very important action item for you this evening. We have a presentation which is in your packets, so I'm not going to dwell on all of the detail in it. I will note, in case you haven't thumbed all the way through to the last 2 pages of the meeting packet in hard copy tonight, there are 2 additional documents which were not in the initial mail out. One which lists the project recommendations in a single table and a map of the project locations. These are all 26 of both of these show all 26 projects that have been evaluated. So that may help as we go along. There's some reference information on there as well. So we're going to cover 6 topics this evening, just kind of refreshing on the context for the 6-year program, the key components of our project selection process, a quick summary of public comments, overview of the recommendations by MBTA staff, and then a more detailed look at those recommendations, and then finally some next steps. So looking at the context information first, I would say that this is the 2nd largest funding program that MBTA has been able to hold, with the only one that's higher than this being fiscal year 2018 to 23, where we actually allocated a full 6 years worth of revenue. So we're only talking about allocating 2 additional years with this program. And total funding to date prior to adoption of this 22 to 27 program is of the order of 2.5 billion. And I'd like to just talk a little bit more about what MBTA has invested in through that 2.5 billion. So we are looking at 12 years worth of revenue, 106 discrete projects for fiscal years 2014 to 2025. And as you look at this table here on the left, we see primary mode of the projects, 106 projects that have been funded, and these are listed in order of the size allocation for each of those modes. I'll talk a bit more about roadway and transit in just a moment, but for roadway, that typically includes new and widened facilities. And generally speaking, not in all cases, but generally speaking, that also includes sidewalks and trails, either new or upgraded with each of those roadway projects. The transit projects, we have BRT, bus acquisitions, maintenance and storage facilities to go with expanded bus services. And then rail, as you see, new and expanded stations, new and upgraded track, intersections, bike pedestrian facilities, and so on down the list to 2.5 billion. So as mentioned, just looking at the roadway projects in a little bit more detail on the next slide. In the left column, you see the function classification of the roadway system from interstate down to local. And then in the extreme right-hand column, actually slightly obscured by the window there, but you can see from your packet in the right column, give examples of the facility types associated with each functional classification. So just going to the bottom line, literally to the bottom line, in the middle in bold, you see in the column new lane miles, 139.82. This is 139.82 or 140 miles of new lane miles associated with MBTA's funding on roadway projects, of which there are 33 which add lane miles. So those of that 140, let's say, additional lane miles, which is associated with the 12 years worth of funding, we have approximately 117 miles on the principal arterial and the minor arterial network. So the bulk of the lane miles that MBTA is adding through its funding is on either the principal or minor arterial networks, although there are major and minor collector road additions as well. Towards the bottom right-hand corner, actually in that bottom row, you see 3.27. That's a percentage. That's the percent increase in lane miles in Northern Virginia associated with MBTA's funded projects. So a 3.25% increase in NOVA lane miles, basically, using those 12 years of revenue. For reference, over the 10 years from 2015 to 2025, using COG forecasts, the population in Northern Virginia will increase by 13% in that time period, and the number of jobs will increase by 16% in that time period. So when it comes to lane miles, the lane miles being added are lagging quite a way behind the increase in population and the increase in jobs in Northern Virginia. And when we next talk about our long-range plan, where transaction where we're looking at 2045, you can extrapolate that further into the future and see larger amounts of growth. Next slide, please, Lorraine. So that was looking at the roadway projects. Just take a quick snapshot of the BRT projects. There are 5 BRT projects that MBTA has funded in part, or yeah, I think in part. None of these are in full, although one of them is pretty substantial from MBTA. So here we're looking at centre line miles. So rather than individual lane mile additions, centre line miles. So this is basically the length of BRT system that's associated with MBTA's funding. And where we can calculate dedicated lane miles, we've done so for the Metroway Northern extension in Arlington County, for which there was a recent groundbreaking, and the Route 1 Richmond Highway BRT in Fairfax County, where the BRT service will run on dedicated miles. So in total, 32.76 centre-line miles. Can't give you a total for the lane miles because the other 3 projects, it's not yet clear where they will be able to add dedicated lane miles. They're still going through preliminary engineering. They need to figure out where they can put it and where they cannot. Next slide. So the context here, in terms of the summarizing the candidate projects, in the left pie chart, it may be difficult to read, but that's representing the primary mode for the 26 projects that are subject to under consideration. In the middle pie chart, you see the dollars, the total dollars requested associated with those 26 projects by primary mode. And in the right pie chart, you see the total cost of those 26 projects. That's comes to just over $3 billion. And obviously the largest slice of each pie is is the deep blue, which is associated with the roadway projects. But there is quite a bit of a dissection project, and then smaller slices of the other modes. So the project selection process, just a few quick reminders before I dive into a little bit more detail. Do the applicants decide which projects are submitted to MBTA for consideration? We do not decide that on your behalf, and each project that is submitted to us not only has to be in transaction, it also comes with a governing body resolution. We won't accept any project for funding consideration without a governing body resolution. We take into account, or we adhere, shall I say, to all applicable Code of Virginia requirements in our process, and we don't use a single factor in making our recommendations. We use a wide range of factors, but we do present the initial analysis, shall I say, is ranked by congestion reduction relative cost, which is one of the Code of Virginia requirements we must adhere to. Next slide. So the actual components of the process are shown here: eligibility, quantitative analysis, qualitative, and public comments. So there are these four components. Under eligibility, I've already mentioned transaction, project must be in transaction, must be a governing body resolution, and obviously, maybe not obvious because we stated the project has to be located in Northern Virginia or substantially located in Northern Virginia under exceptional circumstances. Under quantitative analysis, you see the congestion reduction relative to cost, transaction product ratings, and long-term benefit. These all appear in different pieces of the Code of Virginia, and I'll talk a little bit more about long-term benefit in just a moment. And then we have qualitative analysis. I won't read these, and public comment. I won't read those either. So just taking a little bit of a closer look at long-term benefit, which, as indicated here, is a requirement under House Bill 2313 from 2013, which was the piece of legislation which established MBTA's revenue stream. In underlying text in that first bullet, over the long term, each member jurisdiction receives a benefit that is approximately equal to the share of the regional revenues attributed to that locality. And that's really what drives our approach to long-term benefit. And this is the first funding program where we've actually formally taken long-term benefit into account. It was raised at the previous funding rounds 2 years ago, but we didn't rigorously apply it at that time. We have done so. And essentially what this means is essentially that, you know, each of the 9 member jurisdictions gets something back in terms that's called a benefit in the code. It's not, code specifically doesn't say money. It's a benefit that is in proportion to the revenues that we can attribute to those 9 member localities. The towns in this case are rolled up into the counties, which is very important in our process because the 5 largest towns can submit projects to us. And sometimes they may, and sometimes they may not be aware that if those projects are funded, then the long-term benefit process applies to those projects, but it's kind of effectively charged to the county, not to the town, because that's the way the code was set up. If we kind of situation where we're out of balance, we intervene to try and recreate a balance. Thankfully, the code says approximately equal, because if it said precisely equal, we'd have a real problem. We'd have to spend probably millions of dollars to figure out what precisely equal even is, which is money that could be spent on projects. And I think we collectively agreed as a region we didn't want to burn through money that could be spent on projects, kind of go through a very theoretical process. So if we don't get it right exactly each cycle, we'll come back in the next cycle and the next cycle to keep trying to balance and rebalance and rebalance. It's dynamic though, it will never stay still. And actually there are some factors which could affect the balance even if we don't allocate any new money to any new projects. I would note that when we kind of go through this rebalancing process, we don't take anything away. If a project has been allocated funding, it keeps that funding. What happens is it's projects that have that are under consideration that are affected by this process. So, a project may or may not get funding as a result of a long-term benefit consideration, and that has happened in this cycle. And it is, just to say again, long-term benefit is applied to the jurisdictions, the 9-member jurisdictions, as opposed to individual projects. By extension, it's applied to the projects, but the calculation is done at the jurisdiction level. So whatever is determined for a jurisdiction applies to all the projects that they've submitted as we go through our process. And I'll give you a little bit of an example on the next slide of how this worked. On the x-axis of this graph, the horizontal axis, it's a bit difficult to follow, but it's basically it's numbered from 1 to 10. That's a little bit misleading, but basically each number refers to a jurisdiction, and the jurisdiction is named in the information that's above that. So, Arlington, Fairfax County, Loudoun, Prince William, etc., the member jurisdictions all the way out. So Manassas, Park, right. And then in the y-axis we have percent, and so we have, for each jurisdiction there are 3 icons that are plotted here. The red square is the share of revenue, in this case for 2014 to 2025, that we can attribute for our financial process to each of the member jurisdictions. So Arlington, you see 10.1, Fairfax, you see 41.6, etc. And the Fairfax 41.6 will include, we'll take account of Herndon and Vienna. So that's the revenue. That's the easy part of the calculation. We know the revenues very precisely. The blue triangle and the yellow diamond are 2 methods of calculation that we apply that look at the long-term benefit part of this. And again, these are all plotted as percents. So in the case of Arlington, you see below the 10.1% square, which is the revenue, which is mostly revenue that's been collected, although there are 3 years of revenue which is still in the future as far as this calculation is concerned. So that could change things. But for now, we're going with 10.1%, and you see both the yellow and the blue icons are below that, which that indicates that our calculation, our estimation of benefit is lower than the revenues attributed to Arlington. If you jump across to Prince William County, you see it's flipped. You see 14.9% is the revenue shown against the red square, and then both the blue and the yellow icons are above that. So that indicates that Prince William has received a benefit which is greater than its share of revenue. So Arlington and Prince William, opposite situations. What we've done here, because we can see so much daylight between the red and the other icons, that's the imbalance that we've tried to address in this round. You do also see a little bit of daylight in Fairfax and Loudoun between the red and the blue, and in Alexandria between the red and the yellow. And then as you get to the smaller jurisdictions, it becomes a lot harder to actually see if they're any different at all. So we focus on the bigger differences, and in this case, we focused on Arlington and Prince William in this round of funding. I'll show you more about that later on. On the next slide, this is the totality of the evaluations, both quantitative and qualitative, ranked by project. You know you can't read any of this information. The point here is not that you read this, it is just to kind of show you the extent of the things that we've taken into account. What this doesn't show is what we call geographical modal balance. It doesn't show public comments. It does show long-term benefit, and if you squint your eyes and look very hard at the color-coded columns, the rightmost of those color-coded columns, you see kind of yellows and browns. The yellow in this case is indicating jurisdictions and project applications that are being treated as approximately equal. The brown is showing projects associated with Prince William County, where the benefit is higher than the revenue percent. And in green, which is all the way towards the bottom, you see one project, which is the Arlington project, where the green is indicating that Arlington has received less benefit than would be expected based on the share of the revenue. So that's how it shows up in this chart, just in that simple color coding. Next slide. So I mentioned that previous slide doesn't include public comment, and this one does. So we have one column for each of the 26 projects, and on the right-hand side, there's a 27th column for comments that are called other, which are not specific to a project. And blue is indicative of support for that project, and red is indicative of opposed to that project. I'm going to mention just 3 projects, which are the ones with the longest columns on the left, predominantly in blue with a little bit of red on top. The project which received the most comments is the Arlington project, and most of those comments were supportive. In the middle, you see a column which is predominantly red, but with a decent noticeable amount of blue as well, although outweighed by the red, and that's the Prince William County 027 project, which is the extension of Van Buren Road. And then to the right, you see another project with predominantly blue, a little bit of red on top, and that's the City of Falls Churches project. So obviously a lot of support generated for that project too. Our public comment process attracted comments from 448 individuals, some of whom commented on multiple projects. So when we kind of break that out by project comments, that's 1,609 comments. That's what this is showing. So turning to an overview of the staff recommendations, and as I say, you do have this table and the map which lists these ranked by congestion reduction relative to cost, from highest performing to lowest performing on that metric. So we're recommending 20 of the 26 projects. Of the 20 projects, we're recommending 17 of those recommended for the full amount of the requested funding, and for the other 3, a partial amount of the requested funding. And in each of those 3 cases, the funding that is recommended will cover the entirety of the preliminary engineering phase for those projects, as based on information provided to us at the time of application. There are 7 of the recommended projects are what we call continuation projects, i.e. they've received NBT funding previously, or in some cases, they are very closely related to another project that has received NBT funding in the past. So a very slightly nuanced difference there, but both equally relevant. We're not recommending obviously 6 of the 26 projects, and 2 of those projects are continuation projects. So it kind of highlights that, you know, while being a continuation project is a factor we consider, it isn't necessarily a factor which ends up with a happy outcome. And that's not unusual. But there are a lot of continuation projects that are recommended for funding. And finally, there's 1.4, just over 1.4 million, which we are recommending not to be programmed, be unprogrammed. Next slide. If we take a step back and look at the projects that we're recommending in the context of the projects that have been funded previously, some patterns jump out at us straight away. Continued emphasis on roadway and BRT projects in the Route 1 corridor. Continued emphasis on the Fairfax County Parkway corridor. The transportation technology recommendations include the first Intelligent Transportation Systems project, ITS project, outside of Arlington and Alexandria, where all of the money that's gone on these projects in the past has been focused. So that's quite in my mind, at least a significant step forward for the region, and a continued commitment to decarbonisation of transit. The packet I mentioned earlier, geographic and modal balance. We consider that this packet of recommendations is geographically and modally balanced, and by that, projects are recommended for 8 of the 9 applicants. There's one applicant that submitted one project, which was one of the continuation projects on the previous slide, which was not recommended for funding, but otherwise 8 out of the 9 applicants have projects recommended. It includes recommended funding for all of the primary modes that were associated with the projects that were requested. So roadway, transit, intersection, bike ped and transportation technology all received funding to some extent, and specifically for transit, bike, pedestrian and technology projects. All of those projects recommended full funding. All of those projects full funding. So on the next slide, just kind of summarizing that modal balance piece. On the left-hand side, you see the primary modes. Then the next column is the requested amounts, the recommended amounts, the relationship between recommended and requested. The next column, and then the final column, the share of the overall recommendations by mode. And you'd also see just above the total row, NA means unprogrammed, and that's the 1.4 million that I mentioned. I may have some questions about that, which is fine, but I just want to keep a sense of perspective. That's 0.2% of the entire funding recommendation. So, there are reasons why it's there, but it just, I'll ask you to keep that perspective in questions. And on the next slide, looking at the geographic balance, you see the 9 applicants on the left. The next 3 columns are considering the requested amounts, and the last 3 columns are the recommended numbers. So you do see straight away at the bottom, the town of Leesburg submitted 1 application, and nothing is recommended for the town of Leesburg. But for applicants who submitted 4 or less projects, all of those applications are recommended, although not necessarily. They're all recommended, I think, for full funding. And then in the case of Fairfax County and Prince William County, who submitted more than 4 applications, the share of funding is a bit lower. In other words, not every project was recommended for funding. In the case of Prince William County, there's actually quite a significant difference, like 8 applications, 4 recommended for funding. Of those, I think 2 are partial funding. And so, although Prince William does get 89 million in recommendations, he gets a much lower share than then turning to I'll go through this quickly, the actual list of recommendations, because you already have the list. But the 3 largest allocations in this program ranked in order of the size of the recommended amount of funding are shown here. And these are all either continuation projects or closely related to a previously funded project. So in the case of Fairfax County Parkway, 108 million. The previous funding on the adjacent pieces of Fairfax County Parkway is 124 million. So quite a heavy commitment building on Fairfax County Parkway. For Richmond Highway Route 1 BRT, another 80 million on top of the previous 250 million, which has been allocated by MBTA for this project. And then for Boston MU Metro Rail Station West Entrance in Arlington County, 80 million on top of the 12 million in previous funding for that project. So these 3 projects account for 43% of the funding allocations in this program. On the next slide, we have another 4 continuation projects, again shown in ranked in size order. So in order here, Soapstone Drive extension previously been allocated 15 million. The Richmond Highway widening has been previously allocated 248.4 million. The Loudoun County Parkway interchange at US 50, the adjacent project has been previously allocated 31 million. And for the West End Transitway in Alexandria, this project has been previously allocated 4.6 million. So it's more than double the allocation on this project. The next 10 projects shown here are all projects that are new to MBTA. So this is their first allocation of funding from MBTA, again listed in size order. I'm not really going to dwell on any of these other than to say the smallest project at the bottom, Route 7 Corridor ITS implementation in Loudoun County is actually our #1 ranked project in terms of CRRC, congestion reduction cost. On the next slide, the partial funded projects, there are 3 of these, 2 in Prince William and 1 in Fairfax County. As I mentioned earlier, these are all, well, they're partially recommended for partial funding. The funding amount will fully cover preliminary engineering. We'd like to fund 4 phases, and this will help these projects move forward. Now, the first project here was one of the ones I showed you on the public comment. This is the one that had quite a tall line of in the chart, and most of it was red. And because of that, we were hesitant to recommend this project for full funding at $80 million. We felt that there was a substantive amount of public concern about this project, as well as some public support, that justified only a partial funding for this project. And we hope that Prince William County, in doing the preliminary engineering work, will be able to address the concerns of residents. And then if they decide they still want to continue with this project, subsequently come back and resubmit for future phases, or look elsewhere, smart scale, federal government, whatever, to get that funding, or local sources, obviously. But for now, if they want more MBTA funding, they will have to come back, as is the case for all of these projects. In the middle, at the 7 Corners Ring Road improvements, I have to say we've seen this project frequently in our fund over the last 2 or 3 funding cycles. This is the first time any of these projects have been funded by MBTA, and then the Prince William Route 1 at 123 project. These were a little bit further down the order in the CRRC ranks, and money was running out. We felt that this was the appropriate way to go for these 3 projects.
Mr. Jasper, before we go on, Councilor Miles with the question.
Yes, thank you. I do have a question in reference to the Van Buren project and the partial allocated amount. I know that public comment does not shape the entire decision, but because it did play a factor in the decision being made, was there any way to determine whether those who made those comments were people from Prince William County or in the surrounding areas, or were they possibly individuals from other areas that favored other projects? Is that the concern of the people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm speaking from recollection. We do have a report on this on our website, was presented to the authority at a recent meeting. And I think a lot of the support was local, in a sense, a neighborhood or a number of communities through which would expect to have less cut through traffic if this road were to be built. And most of the opposition came from people who were in the community who would experience a road, in close proximity to where they live now, which has previously been wooded. Now, I would say in terms of the opposition, there were a number of comments from beyond the immediate impact area of the project who were opposed to the project. And I can only assume that was perhaps the more a more ideological position and more of an anti-road position than necessarily anti this road.
Okay.
But that's as far as our public comment would allow us to go. We don't really ask people why they support or oppose something.
Okay.
Our general thought would be that we post all the public comments on our website, and we will encourage the jurisdictions with staff and elected officials to take those comments into consideration as they advance those projects, particularly where there's, as in the case of Van Buren, quite a strong opposition for that project, that they would take that into account. But we, for our purposes, we're looking more at broad numbers rather than what the specific comment was.
Thank you.
So turning finally to the 6 projects that are not being recommended for funding, and unlike all the previous projects, these are actually listed in their CRRC rank. So from highest performing to lowest performing. So the first one of these is was ranked 4, so it performed very well, this project, although to be fair, Old Centerville Road project in Prince William County from the Fairfax County line to Route 28 in Prince William County. The evaluation was done consistently with the way we do all our evaluations, where we look just at this project and compare it to everything that's in the baseline. But we know that in this particular case, there's another substantial project that's received a lot of funding from MBTA, which is not yet fully funded, but is being designed right now, which is immediately adjacent to this project. And so from the beginning, there was a sense that there's overlapping functionality between these 2 projects. So we did do a sensitivity test as well to see how this project performed when we took into account that adjacent project, and its performance actually declined a little, but it was still a fairly strong performing project. I think it still would have been in the top 10 rankings. The reasons why, that was partly the reason why we did not recommend this project for funding. The other reason why we did not recommend this project for funding is because while we're aware that Prince William County and Fairfax County have coordinated on this project, we do not consider they coordinated to the extent that we would feel comfortable that they're in the same place. The project doesn't enter Fairfax County, but it ends in a 2-lane road that is very close to the Fairfax County line. And as a result of that, it's very important to us that both the counties are in exactly the same place, not generally the same place. Well, I think we'll characterize them as being generally in the same place, but they're not, where we would feel comfortable saying, here's an allocation of $96 million, particularly when we've already allocated, I can't remember the number, but in excess of $100 million on the adjacent project. So we've said no to this project in the staff recommendations. The next project is another Prince William County project. Actually, the next 2 projects are both in Prince William County, and these are, I'll take these together. These are both projects that have been included in a county bond referendum from maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
No, 2019.
2019, excuse me, 3 years ago. So we have taken the view, as we have done out in other situations previously, that these projects essentially have a local source of funding. Now, Prince William hasn't necessarily acted on the bond referendum, but the citizens of Prince William County in large numbers have said they support going to the finance market to fund these projects, which is as good as being funded without being absolutely funded. So we've said, no, we're not going to kind of get to this kind of supplanting issue where you get us to pay for something we've already got covered. So we said no recommendation for either of those projects. And then on the next slide, also in Prince William County, Neabsco Road improvements. This is ranked at 20 on the list. We said long-term benefit. No, we're not going to recommend this project. And so that's why that one is on the not recommended list. The next project down is ranked 21 on the CRRC list. Remember, there are 26 projects. This one actually is a project we have previously funded to the tune of $27 million. Project's not really at a stage that it's moving. It is moving in the sense that there's design work being undertaken, but most of that $27 million is tied up in an allocation that can only be used for right of way, which cannot be spent because the design is not ready to do the right of way. So we just don't feel comfortable for that reason, and the fact that at $145,200,000, this is the largest request in the candidate pool. And so we said no recommendation for this project. And then finally, the Leesburg project. And Leesburg is in a bit of a difficult situation here. We have funded this project to the tune of 7.4 million previously. The funding request of 13.3 million is for right-of-way. I think that's all the right-of-way. So you know, it fits with the fact that we like to fund, you know, a fully fund a phase. But the problem is that the project itself is going to cost 185 million total, and there is no clear pathway that we are aware of to get to 185 million dollars for this project. And so, if we did allocate 13 million to this project for right of way, in all honesty, we would not execute a standard project agreement to tie up $13 million that we know and they know could not be spent until they had the full funding, because you generally speaking don't go into construction. So you don't go into right of way until you've got the construction money, or some very high degree of confidence you've got the construction money, particularly when it's so large. And so we really had to say no to this one as well for that reason. But we will work with the town to at least get a better understanding of what they see as the funding strategy for this project, and maybe they'll come back again in future cycles. Next slide. I just wanted to once again revisit the long-term benefit situation. As said earlier, we've applied it this time formally. It affects 2 recommendations. Neabsco Road, I've already mentioned, as a project that's not recommended for funding, which is ranked at number 20, and then a project ranked at 24, Ballston MU West Metro Rail Station entrance in Arlington, is recommended for full funding. And the thing which really pushed that project over the line is long-term benefit. Although it has to be said, other factors in this project, the overwhelming public support that I showed you in an earlier graph, it scores well, or scores strongly on one of our other project rankings, the transaction project ranking. It ranks 8 out of 26 on that. And its modal balance, you know, this is a Metro Rail related project. There's no other Metro Rail projects in this funding cycle. In fact, there's no other rail project in this cycle. So it fulfilled modal balance, and it fulfilled geographic balance, because whether strategically, tactically, or otherwise, it was the only project that Arlington submitted. It was the only project that Arlington we could fund, and that's just, you know, that's just the way it is. So that's the way long-term benefit works out this time. And then the second note here is really to say we haven't rerun long-term benefit based on these recommendations to see whether we have addressed the problem. We know we must have moved the needles in the right direction, because Arlington has been lifted, and Prince William has kind of not been lifted relatively as much as Arlington. So we know it's been addressed. But that's not to say that when we run the numbers again, if this program is adopted by MBTA next month, we might have other imbalances surface, such as in Fairfax County, for example, which was close already, and has got a substantial allocation in this funding program. So, you know, we may be looking more closely at Fairfax County in the next cycle. I don't know. We have not run those numbers. We won't run those numbers for quite a few months. It's not going to be a factor in changing anything for us at this stage. Next slide. I just wanted to quickly return to those little graphics I showed you earlier, which looked at the roadway and BRT projects. You might just be able to see in here that there are some numbers in red. These are the change numbers as a result of these recommendations. So previously, you may recall, we had new lane miles of 140 associated with MBTA funded projects, 33 projects specifically with 12 years worth of revenue. With this program, if these recommendations are adopted, the 140 lane miles goes up to 171.65 lane miles. And previously, we were talking about 3.25% addition to Northern Virginia lane miles. That would go up to just over 4% of increase in lane miles in Northern Virginia. And I recall the numbers I gave you earlier about the growth in population and jobs in Northern Virginia were like 13 and 16% over a 10-year period. This is 14 years worth of revenue. So it's still lagging when you look at it on that basis.
Yeah. So it came up in my mind while you were talking about that question of highway increase in highway miles versus increase in jobs and population. Is there a relationship? Is there a definite relationship between those two? Because one of the things that we've been talking about the multimodal is transportation, right? So if some of it is a speedier way of getting someplace or a different way of getting someplace, do we need to make sure that the miles and what would be the relationship between population growth, job growth, and miles ideally?
I don't think there's I mean, the answer I can give to that question, you said yourself, is that the growth in the region does not have to be met by roads alone. We 100% agree with that, and I think our track record demonstrates that. As I mentioned earlier, the largest single allocation we've ever made to a project is 250 million to the Richmond Highway BRT project, and we're recommending another 80 million this time on that. So I don't think there's any doubt, about MBTA's multimodal credentials. I'll just throw out there 69 million for the Innovation Metro Rail Station and 69 million for the Potomac Yard Metro Rail Station as well. Your own town has a number of projects which are designed to enhance access to Herndon Metro Rail Station. So yeah, I mean,
I guess I'm trying to figure out if there was some theoretical.
Right.
Well, if I could, I would say part of the reason we included this is that we get dinged a lot for being a roadway funding entity. But when you look at the population and employment growth in the region versus the new lane miles we're adding, I would say that it's kind of small looking at the increase in the population and employment, because we have other modes that we're also advancing as well.
So we're boasting about this a little bit, not saying we're behind the.
No, we're not saying we're behind the curve, because again, our goal is that get people out of their SOVs as well. But sometimes, and when we're talking about, equity and what's going on with the whole climate change and all of that, but this is really just more of a factoid, because some of you may or may not have received information. Oh, they're going to build all of these lane miles. When the reality is it's 3% currently, and if MBTA staff recommendations are adopted, it puts us 4%. And then we add on the increases in population and employment. So I think that's what it's meant to do. It's not meant to be a bragging piece by any means, because that means we're also funding other modes of transportation. And where we don't get a lot of credit is, like Keith just noted, Richmond Highway BRT by far has received more money than at one single time than any other project. It has more money on it, and assuming that the additional 80 million that Fairfax County has requested is approved, it will still be the largest award that we put on a project. And we're also advancing 5 different BRT projects. Even though Richmond Highway BRT is the largest, we're actually advancing 5 different BRTs. And then we have the Metro Rail. And I wanted to say, even with Boston, with the congestion reduction score being a little low, the transaction score, which is all of the other performance measures, it really ranked high. So we take all of this into consideration.
That was kind of a little confusing to me because I was thinking, well, then if the population goes up, are we always going to try and have more and more miles? And then where does it all end? So thank you. I appreciate that. And another question I had is on the Neabsco Road improvements. The listed under there was long-term benefit, but it seemed to be a negative. Can you?
It was a negative, yeah.
Yeah, why is a long-term benefit a negative just because of our time schedule?
Prince William has outpaced 14, because I'm saying that 5 cities, 4 counties, and then the 5 towns that can apply directly to us. Essentially, they've outpaced everyone else regarding long-term benefit. So we do, when Keith noted about balancing that, where you had Prince William outpacing, Arlington was under. Now, the law doesn't say by X amount of time or 10 years out, you have to have it balanced. But we do take that into consideration because at some point we can't keep investing and having more money going to one individual locality.
And I had one last question, and I'm sorry to take it. The Edwards Ferry Road, the town of Leesburg request. One of the things that came to my mind when I was reading this was why would they ask for funding for right of way, knowing that they didn't have the 185 million or pathway to the 185 million? Is that something that's apparent to towns and municipalities when
Yeah.
they're figuring out? Do they say, okay, well, we're gonna have, we know we need this amount of money, but we need this specifically for right of way, so MBTA is where we're gonna go for this?
Yeah, yeah. I do not intend to do the town of Leesburg or the staff at the town of Leesburg a disservice by suggesting that they didn't realise this. They absolutely understand this. I mean, they applied for funding for this project last cycle, and at that time we also rejected it. Yeah, they're in a tough spot. Yeah, but there are lots of funding sources they can apply to, but they are a town that's small. I mean, they're our largest town, but compared to counties, they don't have the same pulling power, I guess. So their tax base isn't strong enough to fund this internally. I'm pretty sure they've applied to Smart Scale for this funding.
And they're looking at other funding sources and coordinating with the county as well. We've had this before with the town of Dumfries, with their Route 1 project. They applied for design and they applied for right of way, but then we were like, oh, we can't execute the agreement for right of way because we don't want to just hold right of way until someday when construction funds come through. Now, and what the town did, they applied to the authority for construction and Smart Scale and received both. And that was a great position to be in because number one, it puts the town in a position of leveraging funding sources and not having the authority as the only funding source. And talking to Leesburg staff, they said, yeah, they want to do a little more because I think they also applied for federal money for this project as well. So by the time we have the next call for projects, which is next year, it seems like it's running very quickly, they may know the answer on the receipt of other funding sources.
So they're keeping it current because they know they're gonna need it in the future. Do they expect to get funding for this?
I don't know that
They
were not surprised with
strategy.
the recommendation of no funding. I will say that they were not surprised.
I'm just kind of looking at the structures that this organization has set up to make sure that the funding is allocated in a rational and timely manner, and some of the things,
Right.
if you're looking at them as a layperson.
Yeah, and that's a great question because, smaller localities, they just don't have the tax base or resources that some of the larger localities have. We have a Fairfax or Prince William, but largest and second largest localities in the Commonwealth. I would assume that they could come up with funds from elsewhere. Now, would they want to? That's a different question, but could they? Yes, but then when you're looking at town with, just the budget isn't there, we want to make sure we're doing our part to help them, but we don't want to hold right of way either for an extended period of time. So the town wasn't surprising that they are looking at other funding sources to try to make that difference up. And then they plan to come back, is what I believe.
Well, thank you very much.
And we do have a $7.4 million stake in this project already, so it is in
Yes.
our interest as well to help the town to
Yes.
get to the finish line. But, we can't do it alone, particularly on something this large.
Any other questions at this time?
So I think I just want to go to the BRT slide. There are no additional BRT lines, no changes to centre line miles or dedicated lane miles. However, there are additional funding recommendations associated with the West End Transitway and Route 1, Richmond Highway BRT. So the table's the same, but that's not to say the recommendations don't include more of that. And it's the final slide. Just quickly on next steps, we met with the Technical Advisory Committee last week. Yourselves over this evening, tomorrow evening, we're meeting with the Planning and Programming Committee. The Planning and Programming Committee will actually take into account whatever action you take tonight, whatever action the TAC took last week, and kind of consolidate and make the final recommendation. So will cease to be the staff recommendations. After the PPC meeting, it will become the PPC recommendations. They will be officially posted by June 29th, and then on July 4th, the authority will consider the PPC recommendations. And as Monica alluded to, in May of next year, we anticipate the next call for regional transportation projects. You probably don't get too into the weeds on that part of it, that's your staff, but we just note that traditionally our call for projects has been in early July. So this is a departure from norms, and because it's a departure that narrows the amount of the window that's left to get ready for the next call, we do want to draw it to your attention. The reason we're doing this is because we found that we between the call and the adoption is 12 months, but it's been, there are some real stress points in that, not the least because we end up doing the bulk of the evaluation during the holiday in the winter months when we're kind of competing with staff vacation and sickness and a whole bunch of other things, and so by advancing it by 2 months, we'll kind of move that. We'll basically create 2 extra months for the evaluation process. This will not reduce the amount of time for your staff to prepare the packets and submit them to us, and we'll still end up with an adoption in July of 2024, all being well. So the end date doesn't change, but the start date moves forward by a couple of months. That's it. So the action for you this evening is to either endorse these recommendations from the staff or change them in whatever way you want to change them, noting that if you take money off a project or add it to a project, it's a zero-sum game, right? So you've got to end up with the same total. So the recommendation can't just be, I don't like that, take it out. I want something on it, I want more on this.
Okay. Any discussion? Anybody have any recommendations that, any changes that they think should be made to the recommendations?
You need a motion?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Move that the committee endorse staff recommendation.
Okay. Let's take a formal vote. Well, we can say all in favor. I think it looks like all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Say nay. All right, that passes.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, status of transaction plan update.
Okay. Very briefly, no presentation. We're working on the public comment packet for transaction. You had a very substantial briefing on this at your meeting in May. You're probably going to get another substantial briefing in July. The bits that we didn't have ready at that time, but we are looking to go to request that MBTA approves the dates of the public hearing and the public comment period for transaction at the July 14th meeting, so the same evening that they will take action on the 6-year program. And provisionally, we're looking at starting public comment in early August, which I know is the height of summer, but we were looking to kind of finish that in late September, and we'll be taking some actions along the way to try and encourage people to, or at least make people aware that we're asking for comments and providing an opportunity to do that. The public hearing, provisionally we're looking at the evening of MBTA's September meeting, which I believe is the 8th, is the 8th?
That sounds right. Whatever the second.
Whatever the second Thursday is in
in
September is what we're targeting, and then we're looking to secure adoption of transaction at the December meeting. And if all that happens, then the project list associated with the updated transaction, the one that includes about 429 projects, it may be one or two more than that now, but that will become the new list, the new eligible list for the next funding program. So for this funding program we talked about tonight will be the last funding program under the current transaction adopted in October 2017.
Hey, any questions on that? And MBTA update.
Madam Chair, I will be brief. As you're all probably aware, we now have a budget, no gap tax pension included in that. One thing I do want to bring to your attention, the remote participation. This committee is eligible to have remote meetings, but we on the authority then, we do have to update our remote participation policy. So I'm seeking to have that done at the September authority meeting. So I will keep you posted on that. So you can meet, we as committee would be in a position to meet remotely without coming in.
Thank you. But you won't be here. That's what you're saying? You won't be
No.
here? No. Okay, I missed what you said. Oh, you're all gonna be nice and comfortable. Okay, I understand.
But we wouldn't get dinner.
I
No,
know.
that we will not Uber or do Uber Eats or any of that.
Okay, excellent. Wow, all right, that sounds good. And anything else?
That is all I have.
Okay, and I know Councilmember Seeley, something to update us on the minor space.
Just a quick update. MITRE is going to be bringing their autonomous vehicle to the City of Fairfax Council meeting on July 12th. Before the meeting, it'll be parked outside. It is configured for Army training right now, so it will not be moving, but you will get a chance to see all the sensors that are part of it and talk with the MITRE team that's there. Quick reminder, MITRE is a federally funded research and development center, so they are a nonprofit to share their technology and conversations. If you'd like to learn more, again, July 12th, prior to the council meeting. I think 5:45 is the invitation, and our meeting starts at 7. So you're welcome to come there. So 5:45 will be there. We're going to start our meeting at 7. Great group to talk to, and many of us had a chance to visit with them. And I would hope this would be the first of many stops that you can convince them to make, because they are very interested in partnering and collaborating. Thank you for the time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and our next meeting is July 27th.
So Madam Chair,
Yes.
just
Oh, yeah.
a quick follow-up on that. On July 6th, we're holding the next meeting of our Transportation Technology Committee. And at last month's meeting, Councilmember Steele, you mentioned about the MITRE staff, and also talked about aerial deliveries and taxis and so on. Based on what you were suggesting and my response at the time, we are kind of preparing a very small initial briefing to our Transportation Technology Committee to make them aware that we are looking at that. I want to do a bit more research on it so we understand more fully what that actually means for our transportation development strategic plan. But I will also mention, if I may, your meeting on July.
Please. Absolutely.
Thank you. All right, is there a motion to adjourn?
So-
Adjourn. You're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
I-